Stephen J. Russell was born on the 14th of September 1957. Russell spent much of his childhood believing he was the son of a couple of devout religious Virginian natives who ran a large food company. At the tender age of 9, he learned he was in fact adopted, and his biological parents didn't want him at the time due to being unmarried. He also found out his real parents eventually got married and had a few additional children together. Sadly, they had no interest in contacting young Stephen or any intention of having him rejoin their family home. This deeply troubled the young man, making him feel totally rejected, which led to a change in his character. And that changed character included getting into frequent fights, setting random fires, while simultaneously engaging in all kinds of minor criminal behaviours. His adoptive parents were perturbed by this, yet had no idea how to deal with it. Therefore, they sent him to a boys' home, hoping he'd receive whatever help he required to develop into a respectful young man. While at the boys' home, Russell experienced a number of homosexual episodes with other boys there, which left him confused regarding his identity. This confused state of mind remained with him for years until, astonishingly, in his late 30s, the penny dropped that he was actually homosexual. However, before the penny dropped, he met and fell in love with someone who worked as a secretary, a female who was acutely religious. The couple later married, lived in Virginia Beach and had a daughter together named Stephanie. Stephen ironically worked as a police officer at that point until the couple eventually moved to Texas, where he landed a job at Cisco. But boredom, not to mention his desire for other men, soon prevailed. Hi my friend, I'm Royston, and welcome back to Tea and Crime. The man we're talking about led an interesting life, and although he was a criminal, he had a heart of gold in my opinion. However, he was constantly in trouble with the law, eventually becoming known as the master criminal dubbed King Con. There's been a recent update on this case, and I think we need to do a little deep dive into this. In 1985, Russell experienced more mental trauma when his adoptive father passed away, and this triggered him to take stock of his own life, ultimately opening up his mind to something he'd been questioning for years: his sexuality. He felt it was necessary to talk this through with his wife, which helped him to realise he was definitely homosexual. The couple agreed to an amiable divorce. This man, Stephen Russell, would one day become known as King Con, as he became famous for escaping a number of prisons, including maximum security. His most challenging, grueling and death-defying break for freedom will be looked at a little later, bearing in mind all of his breakouts were non-violent. The 2009 movie I Love You, Phillip Morris, a biographical black comedy drama starring Jim Carrey and Ewan McGregor, is based on the life of Stephen Russell. Have any of you guys seen the movie? And if so, what did you think about it? In your opinion, did it depict the life of this man? Well, let us know down in the comments. After moving on from his wife, his sexual orientation was revealed, and this fact was brought to the attention of his manager when he worked in Los Angeles for a food company. Unfortunately, his manager had a very closed mind. This was back in the 1990s and promptly fired him. Russell later stated that when he lost his job, it really screwed with his head, effectively contributing to his loss of control as far as life was concerned. He got involved selling fake Rolex watches and managed to defraud an insurance claim of $45,000 by falsely professing to have hurt himself in a fall. These activities failed to attract attention from the law. However, he submitted a fake passport application, resulting in his arrest for the very first time in 1992, landing him in the Harris County Jail in Houston with a 10-year sentence. The sentence hurt him, especially as he was in a romantic relationship with a chap called James Kemple. James had recently been tested HIV positive, and back in the 1990s this was effectively considered a death sentence. Stephen was worried sick he'd never see his partner again, and this prompted his mind to go into overdrive pertaining to finding a way to escape in order to be with his loved one. And we might be wondering what he did to navigate his way out of prison. Well, Russell was a man with tremendous observation skills. His eyes and ears were always wide open, soaking up everything that was happening around him. He noticed the shift pattern of the guards, studying their behaviour, just like a psychologist would, eventually concocting a daring, audacious and potentially costly plan. In 1993, while in the prison in Houston, he acquired a t-shirt, red sweatpants and stole a walkie-talkie. He paid close attention to the guards, timing his manoeuvre when they were on smoke break. At that point, he changed out of his prison uniform and into his newly obtained clothes, casually walking past the guards into the visitor area and straight out of the front door. He later explained the idea worked because he used a portable radio to tap on the window where the guards were stationed, an item typically carried by the guards who believed he was an undercover police officer, letting him through. They were deservingly fooled. Stephen, or King Con as he was soon to be dubbed, now realised freedom meant he was able to reconnect with his partner James, spending as much time together before age prematurely ended James's life. And once he met up with James, he quickly explained they had to move swiftly. They decided to head for Mexico, and after a while problems started to develop pertaining to James's deteriorating health, which meant they had no choice but to return to the United States for treatment. When back in the States, Russell was actively looking for ways to support both himself and James, hatching a plan to commit insurance fraud. Unfortunately, it didn't work out as he was detected and consequently arrested after being a free man for about 2 years. Interestingly, he was only caught due to James's plummeting health, as he was doing this to look after his partner. Otherwise, he would have remained free, admittedly free whilst on the run. Sadly, within a few weeks of being re-imprisoned, Kemple passed away. The following spring in 1995, Russell met and fell in love with another inmate called Phillip Morris, a man who spoke softly with a deep southern accent. They met in the law library where Morris was stretching up to reach a book that he just couldn't reach. I guess being only 5 foot 2 inches does that. Whereas Stephen, being 6 foot 2, approached him and sorted the book issue out there and then. And that was their introduction. And thus began another romantic relationship. Both men were paroled later that year, and Stephen immediately jumped into action to look after Morris, similarly to the way he cared for James previously. The first thing he did was apply for a job as a CFO, the Chief Financial Officer, for a massive medical management company. It was called NAM, the North American Medical Management, but he was nowhere near qualified for such an important position. It's important to remember we're talking about Stephen Russell here, the master conman. He researched the company, as well as spending time familiarising himself with exactly what would be required of him. He then created a fantastic resume, enormously embellished with references. And the reason I'm laughing is because those references had telephone numbers attached to them that in actual fact belonged to Stephen, meaning when the company rang for justification of those items, the man answering their inquiry was none other than the master conman himself. And the funny thing I noticed when researching this case was this. Stephen Russell reminded me of one of my favourite actors, the late Robin Williams. And like Williams, he had an incredible talent of changing his voice and speech pattern to sound convincingly natural, as if he was a completely different person. And after giving himself those glowing references, the company in question was thoroughly satisfied and didn't hesitate to hire him, despite the fact he didn't have any real experience in such a high-powered position. Interestingly, the founder of NAM would later admit, perhaps with a measure of embarrassment, that Stephen was amongst the best CFOs he'd ever worked with. And he acknowledged this after his company was embezzled by the conman to the tune of $800,000 taken from right underneath their noses. Although Russell was on a super high income, we might be wondering why he stole from the company, particularly as he could have settled down into a normal life moving forward in a positive light. After all, his employees were thrilled with his work. In short, he wanted revenge. Revenge for how his former HIV-suffering partner James was treated by similar companies. He recalled how James was put through hell during his illness. He desperately needed help that never materialized. Keeping people in hospital for prolonged periods can seriously affect the bonuses regarding such company executives. Therefore, Stephen's mission was to punish them. That was the main reason he stole all of that money. To him, they were heartless gold-grabbing machines, only interested in themselves. He embezzled the company over a 5-month period, and it was only a matter of time before he'd be discovered. When that finally happened, cops were sent to arrest him. Russell had to think on his feet very quickly, as he was determined to avoid going back to prison. But what he did was rather dangerous. He grabbed all of the insulin shots belonging to his partner Morris, telling police that he was a diabetic, then injected himself with 40 doses of this stuff, sending himself into shock. He later explained the reason why he did that was to bring an end to his life, as he preferred dying over being imprisoned again. However, Morris claimed he didn't do this to attempt suicide, but did it to buy himself time, in order to conjure up another idea whilst in hospital. But what do you guys think about this? Was it a genuine attempt to commit suicide? Or was his partner right with his understanding that Stephen needed time to think of a new strategy? Well, let us know your thoughts on this down in the comments. When standing before the judge, who clearly wasn't happy with Stephen's behaviour, especially with the way he mocked the judicial system, plus the fact he was considered an extreme flight risk by now, the angry judge set his bail at the humongous sum of $900,000. Russell was understandably upset. Therefore, his neurons surrounding that smart brain he possessed came up with a reasonable solution. As he was sitting in jail with access to a phone, his lifeline throughout life, he contacted the district clerk and turned into Robin Williams again, impersonating the judge's voice, which convinced the clerk to drastically reduce that bail from $900,000 to $44,000 or $45,000, which was much more reasonable. The following day, Stephen paid his bill, meaning King Con was free yet again. Appropriately for Russell, authorities noticed a mistake was made, mainly due to the cheque bouncing. Now, finding the master conman wasn't difficult really, because rather than run and hide like most criminals, his objective was to locate his partner Phillip Morris and remain as close to him as he possibly could. However, within 3 days, police found and arrested him. This time around, his prison sentence was a hurtful 45 years. Mr. Russell was appalled at that, and once again had to rely on his genius mind to etch out another strategic course of action. I'm not sure if I'd call this a natural ability, as opposed to it being part of the exceptional creative powers of his brain's thinking faculties, but what he did is something we'd normally watch at the movies. I almost forgot. There is a movie about this guy.
When I called all your references, well, they couldn't speak more highly of you.
I cannot speak more highly about Stephen Russell.
Maybe it wasn't the moral thing to do.
You on the lam again?
You always knew me best, but I had no choice.
Stephen Russell, you are sentenced to 25 years.
He started collecting green felt tip markers. I believe he managed to obtain in excess of 100 of them. Once he had enough, he then secretly emptied the ink into a sink, placed his white prisoner uniform into that sink and dyed it green. Why on earth did he do that? Well, like a psychologist, he was very observant, noticing how visiting doctors always wore green uniforms. They were similar to the inmates, with the only significant difference being prisoners wore white. So when he deduced the time was favourable, he simply slipped his new doctor's outfit on, and waited until the person operating the phone was actually on the phone. At that point, he strolled past this character with an air of confidence in each step, walking straight out of the prison environment without even batting an eyelid. This was the maximum security Estelle unit, who proved itself no match for this guy. He then made his way to the woods just outside the penitentiary with a couple of bags contained within himself, filled with arrogance, it would seem. Now he was on the outside, he was keen to distance himself as far away from that prison as was humanly possible. And taking full advantage of his Green Doctor's uniform, he approached a man who he convinced with relative ease that he was a doctor in need of a lift into town. After the event, Stevens said law enforcement had helicopters and search teams hunting for him, yet by the time they did that, he was drinking margaritas in a Houston bar. Even though he laughed about it, the problem was, each time this guy broke free from prison, he developed a bad habit that continually led to being recaptured. Russell would automatically put on blinkers, making a beeline for the man he loved, and in this case it was Phillip Morris. Investigators were aware of this, and as a consequence they tracked Morris down in an effort to pay close attention to everything he was doing. Initially, the couple made it difficult for investigators by absconding to Mississippi. Mississippi? Is that how you say it? Well, that's where they went together. However, in the end, they were located and arrested, and the issue for the law at this stage was embarrassment. The media told their story about this man whilst holding the world's biggest smile. They wrote about how he found it relatively easy to penetrate prison walls, simply walking past guard after guard, nodding to them on the way out. All right, mate? Yeah, see you later. I mean, law enforcement agencies became unbelievably self-conscious as their method of operation was questioned. Because of that, they threw everything they could at Russell, giving him a sentence he really didn't like but nonetheless accepted, which we'll touch on in a bit. And not long after this, Stevens' demeanour started to change, resulting in him appearing less joyful about life. But here's the thing. He was at it again. He was deep into his latest scheme, conjured up by that overactive, creative and manipulative brain. He informed authorities he'd tested positive for HIV and that his life was coming to an end. He somehow managed to falsify his medical records, which he was given access to, thus allowing him to tamper with them. In his cell, he also had access to a typewriter, and after reading up on the illness, he had no issues ensuring his medical records revealed his HIV status. And of course, we know it was a false one. But over the next 10 months or so, officials, including doctors, observed Russell becoming a shadow of the man he once was. He virtually became a bag of skin and bones, losing the best part of 4 stone in weight, while showing all the signs of someone experiencing the late stages of development relating to the AIDS virus. Russell knew all the signs and symptoms of AIDS as he had nursed and watched his first male partner die with it. He was a professional conman, finding it uncomplicated to mimic this disease. Part of the process meant he had to abstain from food as much as possible. And when he did eat, he managed somehow to acquire laxatives to ensure everything went straight through him. And eventually, as his health deteriorated, prison officials believed he was about to die. This caused them to admit him to a hospice near San Antonio on special needs parole in March 1998. Russell then called the hospice officials himself from an internal phone, turning into Robin Williams yet again, impersonating a doctor specialising in experimental AIDS treatment who told them Stephen had been selected for treatment. The next thing he knew, he was sent off to take part in some kind of fictitious treatment. And a couple of weeks later, the prison were informed from that same specialist that Stephen had passed away, meaning he was a free man for the 4th time. What a genius. His audacious actions were pulled off with pure creativity, boldness, and the nerves of steel. Stephen went on to explain that of all of his prison escapes, this one was the most challenging. It required complete discipline. And all of his ideas were formulated by studying and watching for weaknesses that could be exploited. He also mentioned he didn't consider himself superior to the police, even though he had a very high IQ. but managed to get away with it because authorities have this conception that criminals are stupid, which makes the police complacent, he said, giving certain criminals like himself a slight advantage. Unfortunately, after his latest escape, he attempted to get a $75,000 loan from Nations Bank in Dallas, but the bank became suspicious and called the police. However, as usual, this master manipulator had something up his sleeve. He feigned a heart attack in a very convincing manner, resulting in him being transported to a hospital where he was placed on security watch. This created an opportunity for him to use his intelligence-stroke skills to impersonate an FBI agent. He rang the hospital using his mobile phone to tell them that Stephen Russell could be released. Amazingly, they fell for this hook, line and sinker, permitting him to walk out. Then, on April 5, 1998, he was tracked down in Florida and arrested again. Because of the embarrassment it caused the authorities, plus the manpower needed to continually track him down over the years, the judge sentenced him to 144 years in prison. 45 of those years were for the various scams. The other 99 years were for the escapes he made. The unlucky, non-violent criminal was incarcerated at one of the most secure prisons in the world, the Polanski unit in Texas. There, he spent 23 hours a day in solitary confinement, locked up in a small cell, only allowed to leave for 1 hour a day to shower, maybe get a little exercise, or to meet up with the occasional visitor. Prison officials were convinced he was plotting another escape. Their opinion is, no one should ever believe a word he says, because his brain is constantly scheming. After all, he's known as the master conman with infinite charisma, meaning if someone talks to him, it'd probably convince them that he's the President of the United States. Currently, he's been a model inmate for several years, doing everything required to potentially convince the parole board to grant him the freedom he so clearly craves. Whether he's being honest or not is another thing. However, it seems that his fifth escape arrangement is for once being done the legitimate way, and maybe it'll happen, as a recent update revealed he was finally granted parole on the 7th of February 2023, which means he'll be a free man again, possibly very soon. Well, let me know your thoughts on this case in the comment section down below. Well, I'm Royston, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.